Every single nation on Earth is completely broke. The entire planet is drowning in debt. Yet magically, the cash keeps flowing. Global debt has hit a mind-bending $320 trillion. That is literally 3 times the amount of actual money that exists. Which leads to a reality-shattering question. If the whole world is borrowing, who exactly are we paying? This debt trap is not a modern invention. Every major empire in history has played this exact same game. Take the cash today, face the consequences tomorrow. And every single one of them learned a brutal truth. Debt eventually demands total control. Look back 5,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. Local farmers would take grain from their neighbors on a simple handshake. Return it after the harvest, maybe throw in a little extra. There were no massive banks, no legal paperwork, just pure trust. But eventually, these loans became so heavy that early kings had to invent debt jubilees, basically wiping everyone's slate clean just to stop society from burning down. Even medieval royalty were terrible at returning money. Back in the 1340s, King Edward III of England borrowed the modern equivalent of $1.5 billion from Italian bankers. And his response? He simply refused to pay them back. That single, arrogant decision completely shattered the European financial network. King Philip IV of France took things to a much darker level. He literally locked up the very people who lent him money. In 1307, he orchestrated the mass arrest of the powerful Knights Templar. Just like that, his massive debts vanished into thin air. It was the ultimate, brutal solution to a financial crisis. But the entire rulebook was rewritten in the year 1688. The English Parliament stripped away the king's money powers, declaring that all future borrowing would be tied to the nation, not a crown. By 1694, the Bank of England introduced a revolutionary concept by issuing the world's very first government bonds. Everyday people could now lend their savings to the state, make a profit, and feel incredibly patriotic at the same time. However, this new financial engine had one massive roadblock: physical gold. Every single piece of paper money had to be tied to real, tangible gold vaults. That was the unbreakable rule, right up until a single US president flipped the board in 1971. Richard Nixon shocked the globe by announcing that American dollars could no longer be traded for gold. This infamous historical moment murdered the gold standard once and for all. For generations prior, the absolute value of cash was perfectly anchored to that shiny metal. Exactly $35 guaranteed you 1 physical ounce, safely locked inside the vaults of Fort Knox. That rigid system forced governments to actually manage their spending. But following the Second World War, America started bleeding cash on the Vietnam conflict, sprawling welfare initiatives, and rebuilding a shattered globe. By the time 1971 rolled around, the United States had printed such an absurd amount of paper money that foreign nations began demanding their physical gold back. France's President Charles de Gaulle led the charge, aggressively swapping out $191 million for solid gold in the year 1965 alone. The man literally dispatched heavily armed naval warships straight to New York Harbor just to haul French gold out of American vaults. Seeing this bold move, other nations quickly lined up to do the exact same thing. That was the breaking point where Nixon finally slammed the door shut. Almost overnight, cash transformed into pure fiat currency. It holds value for one simple reason: because the government demands that it does. And what was the ultimate fallout? Back in 1971, the entire debt of the planet was sitting at just a few $1 trillion. Fast forward to the year 2000, and that number had mutated into $80 trillion. Cut to today, and we are staring down the barrel of $320 trillion. That is an incomprehensible 31,400% explosion in a mere 50 years. Which brings us right back to the ultimate, terrifying question. Who exactly owns all this debt? This is the exact moment where the story takes a deeply unsettling turn. The true puppet master isn't China, and it's not some shadowy cabal of secret elites. The reality is far more cyclical and strangely terrifying in its simplicity. The answer, ultimately, is you, and simultaneously, you are the exact person deeply in the hole for it. Let me break down exactly how this massive financial trap operates. Let us zoom in directly on the United States, a nation currently drowning under a record-breaking $36 trillion in obligations. A staggering 70% of that American debt is actually owed straight back to American citizens. The country is literally borrowing vast fortunes from itself. Let me pull back the curtain on what actually happens to your hard-earned cash. You drop $1,000 into your local bank account. Your bank absolutely does not lock those physical bills inside a secure vault. Instead, they instantly loan your funds to the federal government by purchasing treasury bonds. The state then burns through your $1,000 to fund infrastructure, military operations, or massive social programs. In return, the government hands over regular interest payments to your bank for holding those bonds. Your bank then tosses you a microscopic fraction of those profits as your annual savings return. But where exactly does the state find the cash to pay that initial interest? They take it straight from your personal taxes. This is where the entire system starts to look completely insane. First, you hand over a chunk of your paycheck as taxes. Second, the government takes your tax money to pay interest on their bonds. Third, your bank happily collects that massive interest payout. And finally, your bank tosses a few pennies back into your account. You are essentially paying yourself with your own money, using the government as a giant, inefficient middleman. It is the ultimate financial snake devouring its own tail. So, who is actively holding the bag on all these massive IOUs? Surprisingly, roughly $7 trillion of American debt is hoarded by its own internal government agencies and trust funds. This means the state is actively indebted to its very own internal operations. The absolute biggest chunk of this puzzle is the Social Security Trust Fund, hoarding well over $2.7 trillion by itself, which means your future retirement payouts are quite literally propped up by empty government promises. This invisible web is woven into your pension, your savings account, your insurance policies, and your golden years. But this terrifying loop extends far beyond domestic borders. Roughly 30% of America's total obligations are actually held by foreign powers. Japan currently possesses a massive $1.1 trillion of American debt. China is sitting on another $816 billion. Even minuscule nations, with fewer residents than a standard metropolitan city, own gigantic slices of the United States. And this is exactly where the illusion becomes a complete circle. America itself owns a staggering $7.86 trillion in debt issued by other nations. Japan holds Chinese IOUs. China stockpiles Japanese liabilities. It is an endless game of financial musical chairs where every single player owes the person sitting next to them. This colossal global debt never actually vanishes. It simply gets shuffled from one hand to another. So, who is the one finally collecting the ultimate paycheck? Here is the devastating final answer to the mystery that kicked off this entire journey. Absolutely nobody gets paid, while simultaneously, everybody gets paid. The entire machine only continues to function because every participant quietly agrees to keep the game going. Therefore, this mind-bending $320 trillion global financial empire runs on one fragile, invisible thread. As long as society maintains the illusion that debts will be settled, the cash continues to flow. The financial serpent endlessly consumes its own tail. The grand illusion marches forward. But what actually occurs when a sovereign nation refuses to participate anymore? It sounds like a straightforward question. However, one modern nation actually dared to test this theory. The immediate aftermath completely annihilated an entire generation. The year was 2010, and the location was Greece. Global investors went into absolute panic mode and completely halted all purchases of Greek bonds. The endless fountain of borrowed cash abruptly ran dry. The international community outright refused to hand them a single extra penny. The European Union issued a terrifying ultimatum: embrace devastating financial cuts or face total national collapse. Politicians mask this nightmare under the polite term austerity, but the reality on the ground was far more horrific. A staggering 25% of all government employees were instantly terminated. Average national salaries plummeted by a catastrophic 30%. The entire economic output of the nation evaporated by a quarter in a mere 5 years. Hundreds of thousands of desperate young citizens were forced to flee their homeland. Highly educated graduates ended up serving tables in Berlin. Brilliant engineers were reduced to driving taxis across London. Heartbroken parents waved goodbye at airports, painfully aware their children might never return home. The national economy flatlined and refused to heal for 10 agonizing years. A vibrant generation was permanently erased. And here is the most agonizing plot twist of the entire tragedy. The nation's actual debt burden did not decrease by a single cent. Instead, it continued to skyrocket. Because when a national economy violently crashes, tax revenues vanish. forcing the state to borrow even larger fortunes simply to keep the lights on. The brutal lesson here is that you simply cannot pull the plug. If you stop feeding the machine, the entire system shatters. Yet there are moments in history when the goal isn't profit, but sheer survival. When the global pandemic paralyzed the world in 2020, consumer spending flatlined and the financial engine violently seized up. Global leaders suddenly stared down the exact same nightmare that destroyed Greece, except this time, it was happening everywhere simultaneously. They faced a terrifying dilemma: do absolutely nothing and watch society implode, or borrow unimaginable mountains of cash just to keep humanity afloat. Every single nation on Earth ultimately chose the exact same path. In that 1 year alone, the United States absorbed a mind-bending $3.8 trillion in new debt. That staggering figure swallowed up nearly 20% of their entire national economy. Japan immediately took on another $1 trillion. China followed suit by soaking up $1.2 trillion of their own. But this borrowed time comes with an inescapable price tag attached: interest. Every single year, the American government is forced to write a penalty check exceeding $1 trillion. This astronomical sum isn't being used to construct modern schools, repair broken highways, or fund medical breakthroughs. It is entirely burned up just paying the fees on past financial sins. That massive penalty is now larger than the entire military budget of the most powerful armed forces on the planet. Wealth that could fundamentally alter human lives is instead quietly handed right back to the banks. And this is where the inescapable trap finally snaps shut. In order to cover the massive payments on those ancient loans, governments are forced to borrow even more money. The original burden never actually vanishes from the ledger. It simply recycles itself into infinity. As long as a nation's economy expands faster than its swelling debt, this twisted illusion actually continues to function. Nations like Norway and Singapore have navigated this financial tightrope with absolute mastery for decades. The fatal flaw is that the rest of the world is not Norway. For emerging economies, this system acts as a literal financial guillotine. Back in 2022, 53 different nations were burning more cash on debt penalties than on keeping their own citizens healthy. They were prioritizing massive payouts to foreign banks over the basic survival of their people. Zambia spectacularly defaulted on a crushing $17 billion obligation. Sri Lanka financially collapsed for the very first time in its entire national history. The state literally ran out of physical cash to purchase essential fuel and life-saving medicines. Desperate and furious citizens violently stormed the gates of the presidential palace. Pakistan hovered perilously close to stepping off that exact same cliff. Countries like Ghana, Kenya, Egypt, and Tunisia are still swaying right on the brink of disaster. And circling silently above all this chaos is China. Beginning in 2013, Beijing has pumped an unimaginable $1 trillion into 150 nations through their massive Belt and Road Initiative, funding megaports, railways, and power grids. On the surface, it sounds like an act of unprecedented global generosity, but there is a deeply sinister shadow hiding behind this money. A huge portion of these struggling nations simply cannot afford the steep repayment terms, and the moment they inevitably default, Beijing does not offer friendly forgiveness. They simply step in and legally seize control of the physical assets. Back in 2017, Sri Lanka realized they could not afford the crushing loan payments for their sprawling Hambantota port project. So Beijing simply swooped in and secured a 99-year lease on the facility, legally grabbing 15,000 acres of prime territory in the process. The small African nation of Djibouti currently owes a staggering 77% of its entire economic output directly to China. Pakistan is suffocating under a massive $30 billion IOU to the Chinese government. Montenegro took a terrifying gamble, risking a quarter of their national wealth, just to build a single stretch of highway. When the payments inevitably stalled, they were forced to beg the European Union for an emergency rescue just to protect their own sovereignty. We are witnessing the terrifying evolution of modern colonialism. This is imperialism powered entirely by debt. Armies and violent invasions are completely obsolete. You just hand a nation a massive check they can never cover and legally confiscate whatever you desire when the trap snaps shut. But what actually unfolds when the core foundation of global trust finally shatters? The year 2008 gave us a horrifying preview when the mighty Lehman Brothers completely disintegrated. global credit markets instantly turned to ice. Massive financial institutions simply refused to lend a single dime to one another. World leaders were forced to inject $12 trillion into the system just to stop the international banking cartel from drowning. Now picture a catastrophic scenario where a major global powerhouse goes bankrupt. Not a smaller player like Greece, but a true economic titan. Imagine Italy crumbling under its massive $3.2 trillion burden, or Japan violently collapsing beneath a crushing $14.8 trillion mountain of obligations. The resulting shockwave would violently rip through the global financial matrix, knocking down economies like a row of fragile dominoes. And you cannot simply run the money printers to escape this nightmare. Venezuela desperately tried that exact strategy. By 2019, their currency was obliterated by a catastrophic 9,586% inflation rate. A simple cup of coffee that cost 2,300 bolivars at sunrise could literally cost you 6,000 by the time the sun went down. Citizens literally dragged garbage bags stuffed with cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Zimbabwe followed that exact same fatal path back in 2008, hitting a mind-numbing inflation rate of 79.6 billion% every single month. The crisis became so extreme that they were forced to completely abandon their own national money and switch entirely to the US dollar. It is a brutal reality check that you can never outsmart mathematics. If you endlessly print paper, your currency becomes totally worthless. If you suddenly stop borrowing, your entire economy instantly implodes. There are absolutely no emergency exits left in this building. The ultimate lesson is terrifyingly clear. There is no painless way to escape this mountain of debt. So, who exactly is the master of this massive global debt? The chilling answer is you, me, and the person living right next door. We are all eternally indebted to one another. We are collectively borrowing from our own future. Your life savings, your retirement fund, and your insurance policies are all permanently locked inside this gigantic, endless loop. This entire charade functions perfectly, right up until the exact moment it shatters. Because at its core, this entire matrix of debt is constructed on one extremely fragile foundation: pure trust. This is precisely why global heavyweights like China, Russia, India, and Turkey are aggressively stockpiling massive reserves of physical gold. They are quietly bracing for the inevitable day when that global trust finally disintegrates. As you listen to these words, global debt is violently expanding by a staggering $100,000 every single second.